The groan of the iron wheels was a long, mournful sound. A beast of steel and steam sighing its last breath as it surrendered to the vast, unblinking emptiness of the plains. For 3 days, that sound had been Lydia May Foster's only constant companion. A rhythmic clatter over endless miles of track that had carried her away from the damp, crowded green of Ohio toward a future promised in neat, careful script on paper that smelled faintly of pine and dust. The letters, tucked safely in a linen pouch inside her bodice, were a testament to a man she'd never met, a man named Jonathan Clark. They spoke of a new life in a town called Dust Rock, of a home to be built, of a partnership. They spoke, in a roundabout, modest way, of love. Lydia pressed her forehead against the cool, grimy glass of the window, her breath fogging a small circle. Outside, the world was a study in brown and pale blue. The sky was immense, a piercing cloudless dome that seemed to press down on the flat, sun-scorched earth. There were no gentle, rolling hills here, no familiar canopy of oak and maple. There was only distance, and the fine, tan-colored dust that coated everything, stirred into phantom shapes by a wind that never seemed to rest. Dust Rock appeared first as a smudge on the horizon, a collection of low, blocky shapes that seemed to grow directly from the soil. It wasn't a town that had been planned so much as one that had simply occurred, a place where the railroad had decided to pause and men had decided to stay. As the train slowed, the details sharpened. Unpainted wooden buildings with false fronts lined a single, wide street. A saloon, a general store, a blacksmith's forge already sending up a thin plume of gray smoke into the morning air. There were no trees to soften the harsh lines, no gardens to offer a splash of color. It was a place built for purpose, not for comfort. A man's town. A knot of anticipation and fear tightened in Lydia's stomach. She was a tall woman, taller than most men she knew back home. Her shoulders were broad from a life of farm work, her hands capable and calloused, her hair, the color of rich, dark soil, was pulled back severely into a practical bun, though rebellious strands had escaped to curl at her temples. She knew she was not a delicate beauty. Her features were strong, her jaw firm, her eyes a serious, steady gray. The letters from Mr. Clark had never asked about her appearance, and she had never offered. They had spoken of character, of a shared faith, of a willingness to work hard. Surely, she'd thought, that was what mattered most in a place like this. The final, shuddering hiss of the steam brakes broke her reverie. A conductor, a man with a face like a worn leather map, walked down the aisle, calling out in a voice weary from 1,000 such arrivals. Dust Rock end of the line is Dust Rock. Lydia stood, smoothing the wrinkles from her simple wool skirt. It was a deep forest green, a color that reminded her of home, but it was heavy and warm for this climate. She took a deep breath, her fingers clutching the handle of the single carpet bag she carried. It was a sturdy bag, one she had sewn herself. It seemed straight and true. Inside, it held all she owned in the world: 2 changes of clothes, a Bible, a small tin of her mother's needles, and a faded daguerreotype of the parents she had buried 2 years prior. She was one of the last to step off the train, her height making her duck slightly under the doorframe. The platform was just a collection of thick wooden planks laid over the dirt, already hot under the morning sun. A handful of people were there, men in dusty hats and worn denim, their faces weathered and guarded. A few women in faded calico dresses, their eyes taking in the new arrivals with a mixture of curiosity and appraisal. Her gaze swept the small crowd, searching for the man from the letters. He had described himself as having hair the color of wheat and being of a decent height. There, near the station master's small office, stood a man who fit the description. He was handsome, in a clean, sharp-featured way. His blonde hair was neatly combed, and he wore a crisp shirt, a rarity in this dusty place. He was looking her way. a polite, expectant smile on his face as he scanned the passengers. Lydia's heart gave a hopeful leap. That had to be him. It had to be. She felt a sudden, sharp consciousness of her own size, of the dust on her boots, of the plainness of her dress. She took a step forward, a tentative smile forming on her own lips. His eyes met hers, and the smile on his face vanished. It did not fade gently. It was extinguished, as if a candle had been snuffed out. His gaze, which had been open and searching, flickered with something else surprise, then a swift, unmistakable wave of disappointment. He looked at her, truly looked at her, from the top of her dark head down to her sturdy, sensible shoes. He took in her height, her broad shoulders, the strength in her frame. His eyes, a pale, watery blue, seemed to calculate and dismiss her in a single, brutal moment. Lydia froze, her forward step faltering. The small smile on her face felt stiff and foolish. She could feel the blood draining from her cheeks, leaving them cold. The distance between them, no more than 20 feet of sun-bleached planking, suddenly felt as wide and uncrossable as a canyon. He did not move toward her. For a long moment, he simply stood there, his disapproval a palpable thing in the dry air. Then, as if coming to a final decision, he took a few stiff steps in her direction, stopping well short of a proper greeting. He did not offer a hand. He did not even tip his hat. "Miss Foster?" he asked. His voice was thinner than she had imagined, lacking the warmth of his written words. "Mr. Clark," she managed to say, her own voice a dry whisper. He looked away from her then, his gaze fixing on some indeterminate point over her shoulder. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with all the things he was not saying. The curiosity of the onlookers on the platform sharpened, their whispers a low hum like insects in the heat. They could all see it. They could all see the rejection taking place. He began, then stopped. He cleared his throat. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding." Lydia said nothing. There was nothing to say. She stood perfectly still, her knuckles white where she gripped the handle of her bag. She felt as if she were made of glass, and that the slightest movement would cause her to shatter into 1,000 pieces. "You're not what I pictured," he said finally. The words were quiet, but they struck her with the force of a physical blow. They were a judgment, a verdict on her very being. All the miles she had traveled, all the hopes she had nurtured, all the careful promises folded in the letters resting against her heart, all of it was undone by those 5 simple, cruel words. "You're not what I pictured." He didn't wait for a reply. There was none she could give. With a final, dismissive glance that took in none of her, only the space she occupied, Jonathan Clark turned his back on her. He straightened his shoulders, adjusted his collar, and walked away. He melted back into the small cluster of townsfolk, a man eager to distance himself from his mistake, leaving Lydia May Foster standing alone on the platform. The train whistle blew a sharp, final blast, and with a great chuffing of steam and clanking of metal, it began to pull away, gathering speed to retreat back toward the world she had left behind. The sounds of the town began to filter back into her awareness, the clang of a hammer on an anvil, the distant whinny of a horse, the murmur of voices. The whispers about her grew a little louder now, no longer veiled. She could feel their eyes on her, 100 tiny needles pricking her skin. She was a spectacle. The tall woman nobody came to claim. But Lydia did not cry. She would not give him, or this town, her tears. She lifted her chin, her spine as straight and unyielding as the iron rails that stretched to the horizon. She stood rooted to the spot, a solitary, unmoving figure in a green wool dress, her hand gripping a bag full of a life that was never going to be, and watched the empty space where the man with hair like wheat had been. The sun beat down, and the wind blew, and the dust of dust rock began to settle on her shoulders like a shroud. The world, which had narrowed to the space occupied by Jonathan Clark's retreating back, slowly widened again, The sounds of dust struck, which had been a dull and distant roar, sharpened into focus. The rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer. The rattle of a wagon down the far end of the street. The murmur of voices from the saloon porch. They were the sounds of a life that was moving on. A life that had no place for her. The whispers came first. They were like the rustle of dry leaves in the wind. Indistinct, but everywhere. She could feel them more than hear them. A shift in the air as heads turned and hands came up to cover mouths. Then came the stares. They were not subtle. On the frontier, curiosity was a raw, undisguised thing. The women by the general store, their shopping baskets resting on their hips, watched her with hard, assessing eyes in their faces. She saw a flicker of pity, quickly replaced by a kind of grim thankfulness. This public humiliation was hers, not theirs. It affirmed their own precarious positions, their own successful bargains. The men were different, a few cowboys. Leaning against the wooden awning of the saloon, made no pretense of hiding their interest. They nudged one another, their gazes sweeping over her with a bold, measuring quality. Their amusement was plain. She was a curiosity, a piece of unexpected midday entertainment. The tall woman, the jilted mail-order bride, a story they would tell over cheap whiskey later tonight, embellished with each retelling. For a long moment, Lydia remained where she stood on the station platform. To move felt like an admission of defeat, yet to stay was to endure the relentless weight of their scrutiny. The train was gone. The platform was empty save for her and the station master, who was now making a great show of sweeping dust from one patch of wood to another, his broom moving with a slowness that betrayed his true focus. She had to move. Taking a breath that felt like breathing dust, she bent, her back straight, and picked up her bag. The movement was deliberate, unhurried. She would not scurry away like a frightened mouse. She settled the weight of it in her hand and turned, not back toward the empty tracks where her hope had departed, but toward the town itself. She took her first step off the platform and onto the wide, rutted street. The dust was ankle-deep in places, a fine, pale powder that rose in little puffs with each step. It clung to the hem of her green wool skirt, turning it a dusty brown. The sun was high now, a merciless white eye in the vast blue sky, and the heat beat down on her head and shoulders. There were no trees to offer shade, only the sharp, geometric shadows cast by the buildings themselves. She walked down the center of the street. It was not a conscious choice, but an instinct. To walk on the narrow wooden sidewalks would have brought her too close to the whispers, too near the staring eyes. In the open, she felt exposed, a solitary ship on a brown, dusty sea, but at least the distance was her own. Dust Rock was a town built of raw lumber and pragmatism. The buildings were unpainted, the wood already weathered to a silvery gray by the relentless sun and wind. False fronts gave the saloon and the general store an illusion of grandeur that was immediately betrayed by the smaller, simpler structures behind them. This was a place where appearance was a thin veneer over a hard reality, a lesson she was learning with every step. As she walked, she became acutely aware of her own height. Back in Ohio, she had been a fine, strong girl. Here, she was an anomaly. She passed two men haggling over a sack of flour outside the mercantile. As they turned to watch her, they had to lift their chins slightly. Their surprise was visible. This was a land where men were mountains and women were meant to live in their shade. A woman who met a man's gaze on his own level was an unsettling thing. It was unnatural. It was, perhaps, the very core of what Jonathan Clark had seen and rejected. He had not pictured a woman who could look him square in the eye. He had pictured someone to look asterisk down asterisk upon. She did not look at them. Her gaze was fixed on the far end of the street, though she had no destination in mind. She focused on the simple mechanics of walking, of placing one heavy, dusty boot in front of the other. The shame was a physical thing, a hot, burning coal in the pit of her stomach. Humiliation was a cloak. heavy and suffocating in the dry heat. She could feel the color in her own cheeks, a betraying flush that she prayed the harsh sunlight would hide. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide, to find some dark corner and curl into a ball. But a deeper, older instinct, one forged by loss and hardship, refused. It was the stubborn pride of the survivor, the simple, mule-headed refusal to be broken. At the end of the street, where the town began to fray back into the open prairie, stood a church, or what had once been a church. It was a simple, white-painted building with a modest steeple from which no bell had likely ever rung. The paint was peeling in long, curling strips, revealing the gray wood beneath. One of the windows was boarded over, and the door hung slightly askew on its hinges. Weeds, tenacious and green, grew up between the cracks of the 3 wide wooden steps that led to the entrance. It was a place of abandoned faith, a forgotten sanctuary. It seemed a fitting place to rest. Lydia crossed the last few yards of dusty ground and stopped at the foot of the steps. The silence here was deeper, away from the main bustle of the street. The building cast a long, cool shadow, offering the first real respite from the sun she had found, with a weariness that went far beyond the long train journey. She sat down on the bottom step, the wood rough and splintered against her palms. She placed her bag neatly beside her, as if she were a passenger waiting for a coach that would never arrive. She did not weep. The tears were a hard, hot lump behind her eyes. But they would not fall. Crying felt like a luxury, an indulgence she could not afford. Crying was for a hurt that could be healed, a sorrow that could be comforted. This was something different. It was a hollowing out, a quiet erasure of the woman she had been when she'd stepped off that train only an hour ago. The letters were still tucked in her bodice. She could feel the stiff corners of the envelopes pressing against her skin with every breath. They had been her talismans, her proof of a brighter future. She had read them so many times that the words were memorized, the ink strokes as familiar as the lines on her own hands. Asterisk. I picture you here, Lydia, making a home from this wild country. I am a plain man, but an honest one. I pray you are the same. An honest one. Perhaps he had been. He had honestly looked at her and found her lacking. She did not pull the letters out. To read them now would be a form of self-torture. To look upon his neat, careful script would be to see the lie in every word. They were not promises anymore. They were just paper and ink, the relics of a fool's hope. She left them where they were, a small, sharp pain against her ribs, a final, lingering reminder of her mistake. She sat for a long time, watching the dust motes dance in the bars of sunlight that fell between the buildings. The town went on around her. The blacksmith's hammer kept its steady rhythm. Children's shouts could be heard from somewhere behind the houses. A dog barked, a sharp, lonely sound. She was an island of stillness in a river of life that flowed past, uncaring. She did not speak. She did not move. She just sat on the steps of the abandoned church, a woman who had traveled 1,000 miles to be told she was not what a man had pictured, and now had nowhere left to go. The sun crept across the sky, a slow, indifferent journey, pulling the shadows of dust rock long and thin across the dirt. Lydia had not moved. She had become a part of the forgotten church, as still and silent as the peeling paint and the boarded window. The initial, fiery sting of humiliation had cooled into a vast, cold emptiness. She was adrift, a vessel whose anchor had been cut loose, and this small, splintered step was the only piece of land in an endless sea of uncertainty. The life of the town continued its rhythm around her. She heard the noon whistle from the new railroad depot. She heard the clink of glasses and a burst of rough laughter from the saloon. A woman called out for her child, her voice sharp with impatience. These sounds were from another world, one she had hoped to join but now could only observe from a desolate shore. She watched a lizard scuttle across a hot rock, its movements quick and certain, and felt a pang of something like envy for its simple, unquestioning existence. It was the sound that broke her trance. It wasn't the clatter of a wagon or the quick footfalls of a man in a hurry. It was the slow, rhythmic beat of a single horse at a walk. The sound was heavy, deliberate, coming up the street with no urgency. It spoke of patience, of a journey with no pressing end. She didn't look up. She had learned the price of meeting a stranger's gaze in this town. She kept her eyes fixed on the warped planking at her feet, tracing the grain of the wood with her gaze, willing the rider to pass by, to leave her to her silent vigil. The hoofbeats slowed, then stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the soft snort of the horse and the creak of saddle leather. They had stopped right in front of the church, right in front of her. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, pricked at her skin. She tensed, bracing herself for another voice of judgment, another pair of eyes filled with pity or scorn. She did not raise her head. She heard the soft thud of boots hitting the dusty ground. The jingle of spurs was muted, worn. These were not the loud, showy spurs of a young buck, but the quiet, functional tools of a man who spent his days in the saddle. Slow, heavy steps approached, stopping a respectful distance from the steps. She could see the man's boots without lifting her head. They were old and scuffed, the leather dark with use, coated in the same pale dust that covered everything. They were the boots of a man who worked, not a man who postured. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind sighing around the corner of the old church. She waited, her jaw set, her hands clenched into fists in her lap. Then a voice spoke, and it was not what she expected. It was a low, quiet voice, with a rough edge to it, like river stones rubbing together. "I saw you from the hill above." The words were a simple statement of fact, offered without preamble. They were not an accusation, nor an opening for conversation. They simply were. Slowly, cautiously, Lydia lifted her head. The man standing before her was of average height, his frame lean but solid under a canvas duster that had been bleached by the sun to the color of old bone. His hat was pushed back on his head, revealing hair the color of dark walnut, streaked with a little gray at the temples. His face was weathered, browned by the sun and lined by the wind. The kind of face that held its thoughts close. And there, just as the outline had promised, was the scar. It was a thin silvery line beneath his left eye. Not a disfigurement, but a quiet piece of history written on his skin. He wasn't looking at her. His gaze was directed past her, toward a lone, gnarled pine tree that clung stubbornly to a ridge on the far horizon. His eyes, a deep and startling blue in his sun-browned face, were fixed on that distant point, giving her the freedom to study him without being scrutinized in return. It was a strange and unexpected courtesy. "My name is Silas Boone," he said, his eyes still on the tree. "I don't like to see folks alone." Lydia's throat was tight and dry. She didn't know how to respond. The kindness in his simple statement was so at odds with the cruelty she had just endured that it felt foreign, dangerous. Pity was a currency she did not want to trade in. "I'm fine," she said, and the words came out as a croak. She cleared her throat and tried again, forcing a strength into her voice she did not feel. "I'm just resting." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, as if accepting her lie at face value. He made no move to leave, but he made no move to come closer, either. He just stood there, a quiet presence against the vast, empty backdrop of the plains. His horse, a sturdy buckskin with an intelligent eye, shifted its weight behind him, the saddle creaking again. Man and horse seemed to be a single, patient entity. "The afternoon sun is strong on these steps," he observed, his voice still quiet. "Matter of fact, it can fool a person. Saps the strength right out of you before you even know it's gone." He wasn't asking questions. He wasn't prying. He was just talking about the sun, the steps, the heat. He was filling the silence with simple, harmless truths, giving her space to breathe within them. She found herself watching his face, the way the muscles in his jaw worked slightly as he spoke. He seemed a man unaccustomed to easy talk, as if words were tools to be used carefully and for a specific purpose. The silence returned. Longer this time. Lydia felt the tension in her shoulders ease just a fraction. This man was not like the others. He was not Jonathan Clark, with his quick, dismissive judgment. He was not the smirking cowboys at the saloon. He was something else, something she didn't have a name for. She finally found her voice again, though it was barely a whisper. "Why are you here, Mr. Boone?" He was quiet for a moment, as if considering the question from all angles. His gaze remained fixed on that distant, solitary pine. "I saw the train come in," he said, his voice dropping even lower, "and I saw it leave. Saw a man walk away. The whole town was watching. It ain't right, a thing like that." He said it so simply, with such quiet conviction, that it pierced through the wall of numbness she had built around herself. He had seen, he had understood, and he had named the injustice of it without an ounce of pity in his voice. Only a plain-spoken sense of right and wrong. A hot tear finally escaped, tracing a clean path through the dust on her cheek. She turned her head away sharply, angry at herself for this show of weakness. And then he said the thing that would change everything. He must have sensed her movement, her shame at the tear, because he spoke again, his voice gentle but firm. "I don't look," he said, still not turning his gaze toward her, "but I listen." The words hung in the still, hot air. I don't look, but I listen. It was the opposite of Jonathan Clark's final, damning verdict. "You're not what I pictured." One man had judged her with a single glance. This man was offering to understand her without looking at all. He was offering her a sanctuary from the tyranny of sight, from the world that had measured her and found her wanting, in his strange, indirect way. Silas Boone was offering her a respect so profound it left her breathless. She kept her face turned away, but for the first time since stepping off that train, she did not feel entirely alone. Lydia remained on the step, his words echoing in the quiet space he had created. "I don't look, but I listen." It was a strange and powerful creed for a man in a world that was all harsh light and hard edges. For the first time, she felt a flicker of something other than shame or fear. It was a fragile, tentative curiosity. She looked at his boots, then at his worn, capable hands, and finally, up at his face, which was still turned toward the distant pine. He seemed to feel her gaze. "The day is half gone," he said, his voice still low and even. "A person needs a place to be when the sun goes down. Will you come?" It wasn't a command. It was a question, quietly offered. She thought of the whispers, the stares, the long, lonely night ahead if she stayed where she was. She thought of Jonathan Clark's handsome, cruel face. Then she looked at this stranger, this man with the scar and the quiet eyes who had offered her the dignity of not looking at her. The risk was immense. He was a man she did not know, leading her away from the meager safety of the town. But the certainty of what awaited her if she stayed was, in its own way, far more terrifying. Slowly, stiffly, she rose to her feet. The movement sent a sharp ache through her cramped muscles. She picked up her bag, its familiar weight a small comfort. "All right, Mr. Boone," she said, her voice barely audible. He gave that same slight, accepting nod and turned without another word. He untied his horse's reins from the rotted hitching post in front of the church, and the buckskin fell into step behind him like a loyal dog. He started walking, not on the main road that led back through town, but on a smaller, less traveled track that skirted the edge of dust rock, heading toward the low, rolling hills. He did not look back to see if she was following. He trusted that she was. The walk was a silent one. He kept a steady, unhurried pace a few yards ahead of her, giving her space to breathe and think. The sounds of the town, the blacksmith's hammer. The saloon's noise faded behind them, replaced by the whisper of the wind through the dry sagebrush and the crunch of their boots on the gravelly soil. The sun was warm on her back, and the immense, silent landscape seemed to absorb her sorrow, drawing it out of her until the sharp edges began to soften. She watched the steady motion of Silas Boone's shoulders under his faded duster and felt the hard knot of fear in her chest begin to loosen, thread by painful thread. His home was not far, perhaps a quarter of a mile from the last house in town. It sat nestled in a slight hollow, sheltered from the worst of the wind by a small rise and a cluster of resilient junipers. It was a log cabin, built with a skill that was immediately apparent. The logs were tightly fitted, the chinking between them neat and solid. A chimney of carefully chosen river stones rose from one end, a thin curl of smoke suggesting a fire banked low inside. A sturdy woodpile was stacked neatly against the wall, and a well-worn axe was sunk into a chopping block. It was a place of solitude and self-sufficiency. It was simple, but it was not derelict. It was a home. Silas led his horse to a small corral beside the cabin, uncinching the saddle with practiced, efficient movements. Lydia stopped near the door, her hand clutching the handle of her bag. Feeling suddenly like an intruder, this was his sanctuary, a place he had built for himself, and she was a stranger bringing her trouble to his doorstep. He finished with his horse and walked over to the cabin door, which he pushed open. "It's not much," he said, his back to her, "but it's solid." He stepped inside, and after a moment's hesitation, she followed him. The air inside was cool and smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and something clean, like dried herbs. The cabin was one large room, but it was orderly and uncluttered. Sunlight streamed in through two small, clean windows, illuminating the honest, hand-hewn furniture. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth swept clean. A thick timber served as the mantel, and on it sat a few books, a tin of tobacco, and a small, intricately carved wooden box. A sturdy table with two chairs stood in the center of the room. A bed, covered with a simple wool blanket, was built into the far corner. Everything was functional, worn with use, and possessed a quiet, masculine grace. It was the home of a man who lived alone, but not a man who had let himself go. Lydia's gaze was drawn to a rocking chair that sat empty beside the hearth. Unlike the other furniture, it was made of a darker, smoother wood, polished by time and use. It seemed to hold a space for someone, a silent, waiting presence in the room. Silas did not seem to notice her inspection. He moved with a quiet purpose, stoking the embers in the fireplace and adding a small log. The flames caught, casting a warm, flickering light across the room. He straightened up and turned to her, though his eyes still did not quite meet hers, focusing instead on the wall just behind her head. "It's temporary," he said, his voice soft but clear, "for you to catch your breath, until you find a place you mean to stay." The generosity of the offer, stated so plainly and without condition, was overwhelming. He was giving her a roof over her head, a safe harbor, and most importantly, the dignity of choice. Asterisk, until you find a place. He was not assuming she would stay, nor was he implying she was his responsibility. He was simply providing a moment of grace. A wave of emotion so powerful it made her dizzy washed over her. She opened her mouth to say thank you, but the words felt too small, too hollow for the magnitude of his kindness. The question that burned in her mind was asterisk, why asterisk? Why would a stranger do this? What did he want after the morning's brutal lesson? She could not believe in kindness without a cost. She must have swayed slightly, because he took a half-step toward her, a flicker of concern crossing his face before he caught himself. He stopped and gestured to one of the chairs at the table. "Sit. You've been on your feet a long while." Lydia sank into the chair, placing her bag on the floor beside her. Her hands trembled slightly where she rested them on the rough wooden surface of the table. She stared at the patterns in the grain, unable to voice the question that filled her heart. Silas seemed to hear it anyway. He walked over to the window and stood looking out at the endless plains, his back partially to her. The afternoon light framed his silhouette. My wife, Sarah. She built that rocking chair with her father. He said, his voice quiet, conversational, as if he were merely commenting on the weather. Carried it all the way from Missouri. Said a house ain't a home without a place to rock. Lydia's breath caught in her throat. She looked over at the empty chair. There was a blizzard, 3 winters back, he continued. His voice never changing, its even, steady tone. Came on sudden. I was out checking my trap lines. Got caught in the whiteout. Took me 2 days to find my way back. The snow was higher than the door. He fell silent. The only sound in the cabin was the soft crackle of the fire. Lydia could picture it, the suffocating wall of white, the desperate, frozen struggle for home, the terrible silence that must have met him when he finally broke through. She was gone. The fire had died. The cold, it got in. He paused, and for the first time, a rough edge of old pain entered his voice. I sat with her for a day, waiting, for the preacher, for a neighbor, for anyone. Just for someone to come, to not be so alone with it. He turned his head slightly, his gaze finally moving from the window to the empty rocking chair by the fire. Because once, he said, his voice so low she had to strain to hear it, I needed someone to do the same, and no one came. And in that moment, Lydia understood. His charity was not charity at all. It was an answer to an old, unanswered prayer. He was giving her the help, the simple human presence that had been denied him in his own darkest hour. He was not saving her from pity. He was repaying a debt to a ghost, mending a tear in his own past by sheltering a stranger in the present. She looked at this quiet, solitary man, and the hard shell of her own grief and humiliation finally, completely, broke, and she wept. Not for the man she had lost, but for the one she had just found. The tears, when they finally subsided, left Lydia feeling scoured and empty, but strangely calm. The storm had passed. She had wept in front of this quiet stranger, and he had not offered empty platitudes or awkward pats on the shoulder. He had simply let the grief run its course, a silent, steady witness in his own home. When she was done, he had poured her a cup of water from a bucket by the door and then busied himself with cleaning a rifle. The rhythmic, metallic scrape of the cleaning rod, a strangely soothing sound in the twilight. She had slept on a pallet of blankets he'd laid out for her near the hearth, the warmth of the embers chasing away the deep chill that had settled in her bones. She woke to the smell of coffee and the pale, gray light of dawn filtering through the windows. The cabin was empty. Silas was gone. The pallet she had slept on was neatly folded at the foot of the built-in bed, which itself was made with military precision. A tin cup of steaming black coffee and a thick slice of coarse bread sat on the table, left for her. It was another one of his quiet, practical kindnesses, a gesture that spoke more than a dozen polite inquiries about how she had slept. She ate the bread and drank the coffee, the warmth spreading through her. She was a guest here, a recipient of a charity she could never repay. The thought chafed at her. Her entire life had been about work, about earning her own way, about being useful. To be idle was a state she could not endure. She looked down at her hands, calloused and capable. They needed a task. Her mind, reeling from the shock of the day before, needed a focus. She found him out by the corral, checking the hoof of his buckskin horse. He moved with an economy of motion, his hands sure and gentle on the animal. He did not seem surprised to see her, merely acknowledged her presence with a slight dip of his chin. "Mr. Boone," she began, her voice still a little rough. I can't just take your food and shelter. It isn't right." He continued his work, lifting the horse's hoof and inspecting it closely. "I haven't asked for anything." "I know, but I am asking," she said, her voice gaining a bit of its old strength. "I need to work. It's all I know." She hesitated, then plunged ahead, behind the cabin. "There's a small lean-to, the one built against the rise of the hill. Is it used for anything?" He set the horse's hoof down and straightened up, finally turning to look in her general direction. Just storage, rotted sacks, old tools, nothing of value. I have my needles and thread, she said, her hand instinctively going to the small tin she kept in her bag. I am a good seamstress. I can mend. People in a town like this, things must get torn, clothes must wear out. It was a desperate, flimsy plan, built on nothing but a handful of steel needles and a lifetime of practice. She expected him to dismiss it, to tell her it was foolish. Instead, he was quiet for a long moment, his blue eyes looking past her at the lean-to, as if seeing it for the first time. All right, he said simply. That one word was all the permission she needed. He didn't question her. He didn't offer advice. He simply accepted her intention and then, in his way, helped make it possible. He spent the next hour with a shovel and a wheelbarrow, clearing out the small, forgotten space. It was little more than a shed, with a packed earth floor and a low ceiling of rough-hewn planks. It smelled of damp soil and decay. Spiders had been its only tenants for years, but it had a sturdy door and a small, high window that, once Silas had cleared the grime from it, let in a sliver of determined sunlight. While he worked, she swept and scrubbed, using an old broom and a bucket of water from the well. By midday, the space was transformed. It was still humble, still nothing more than a glorified root cellar, but it was clean. It was a beginning. Lydia set up her new place of business with the few things she had. She used an old crate Silas had cleared out as a chair, and another, larger one as a work table. She laid out her precious needles, her spools of dark and light thread, her thimble, and a small pair of shears. It was a meager arsenal, but in her hands, they were powerful tools. Her first task was to mend Silas's work shirt. She found it slung over the back of a chair, a long, ragged tear under the arm. The fabric was worn thin, but it was a good, sturdy cotton. She took it to her new workshop and set to work. The familiar motion of the needle was a balm to her spirit. Push, pull, loop. Each stitch was a tiny act of creation, of bringing order to something that was broken. She didn't just patch the hole. She carefully rewove the edges of the tear, her stitches so small and neat they were nearly invisible. She reinforced the seam, making it stronger than it had been before. When she was finished, she folded it neatly and left it on the table in the main cabin. Silas said nothing about it when he returned that evening, but the next morning, he was wearing it. For a week, that was all she did. She mended Silas's things, patched his blankets, reinforced the seams on his canvas duster. She worked from sunup to sundown, losing herself in the quiet, repetitive task. It was a way of paying her rent, of making her presence in his home less of a burden and more of a quiet exchange. The town, for its part, left her alone. She was the woman who lived with Silas Boone, the quiet, scarred man who kept to himself. The whispers had not stopped. She was sure, but they were no longer directed at her on the street. She had become a part of Dust Rock's landscape, a curiosity that was slowly becoming a fixture. Her first customer arrived on a Tuesday. It was Martha Miller, the wife of a farmer who worked a dry, unforgiving patch of land a few miles out. She was a thin, tired-looking woman with kind eyes and hands raw from work. She came to the cabin door hesitantly, clutching a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "Mr. Boone?" she asked, her voice nervous. "He's out," Lydia replied, stepping into the doorway. Martha Miller looked startled. Then her eyes fell to the neat patch on Lydia's own apron. I heard you mend things." "I do," Lydia said simply. The woman unwrapped her bundle. It was a child's dress, made of cheap, faded calico, with a large L-shaped tear in the skirt. "It's my daughter's favorite," the woman said, her voice apologetic. She caught it on a nail. "I tried to fix it, but my eyes aren't what they were." Lydia took the small garment. The fabric was soft with countless washings. It was more than a dress. It was a piece of a child's world. "I can fix this," she said. Come back before sundown." Martha Miller nodded, relief washing over her face. "What do I owe you?" Lydia thought of the meager supplies in Silas's pantry. "A few potatoes, if you have them to spare." When the woman returned later that day, Lydia handed her the dress. The tear was gone, replaced by a neat, almost invisible seam. Lydia had even taken a tiny scrap of fabric from the inside hem and fashioned it into a small, decorative flower to cover the weakest point of the tear. Martha Miller stared at it, her work-roughened fingers tracing the stitches. She looked up at Lydia, her eyes shining. It's better than it was before." She said nothing more, just pushed a small sack of potatoes into Lydia's hands and hurried away. Word traveled, slowly, hesitantly. Others came. They brought torn shirts, worn-out trousers, blankets frayed at the edges. They were the poor and the practical, the people who could not afford to buy new from the mercantile. They came to her little lean-to, their gazes often shy, their words few. They rarely spoke of what had happened at the train station. They spoke of the rip, the tear, the hole, and Lydia, in her quiet, sun-starved workshop, would listen and nod, her needle ready. She took payment in eggs, in flour, in a pail of milk or a handful of carrots. She was becoming a part of the town's hidden economy, the one built on barter and mutual need, not on cash and credit. One afternoon, an old woman named Elspeth Gable came to her door. She was the town's oldest resident, a woman whose eyes had seen dust rock grow from a single tent into a town. She moved slowly, leaning on a cane, and carried a small, yellowed linen parcel. "They say you have good hands," the old woman said, her voice like the rustle of dry paper. "I try my best, ma'am," Lydia replied. Mrs. Gable unwrapped the parcel. Inside was a piece of intricate lace, a collar from a dress that must have been 100 years old. It was torn in several places, the delicate threads broken. "It was my mother's," she said, "from the old country. I thought it was lost for good." Lydia took the lace with a reverence she would have given a sacred text. She held it up to the sliver of light from the window, studying the complex pattern. For 2 days, she worked on nothing else, her needle moving with the patience of a spider spinning a web. She did not just mend the holes, she recreated the pattern, her thread following the ghost of the original design, until the new could not be distinguished from the old. When Mrs. Gable returned, Lydia laid the finished piece on a clean cloth for her to see. The old woman picked it up, her gnarled fingers trembling as they traced the restored pattern. She was silent for a very long time, her old, faded eyes looking not at the lace, but at Lydia. "Child," she said finally, her voice soft with wonder, "you do not just sew. You sew as if you are telling a story with a needle and thread. You are telling the story of what was and what can be again." The old woman paid her with a silver dollar, the first real coin Lydia had earned. But it was her words that were the true currency. They named what Lydia was doing. Not just for the town, but for herself. She was taking the broken pieces, the discarded remnants, and with patience and skill, she was making them whole again. The days settled into a rhythm, as steady and quiet as a slow heartbeat. Summer's fierce, bleached-out sun gave way to the gentler, golden light of early autumn. The air grew crisp in the mornings, and the wind carried the dry, sweet smell of distant prairie grass. For Lydia, this rhythm was anchored by the hum of her own work and the steady, predictable presence of Silas Boone. Her world was the small lean-to, a space that was no longer a dusty, forgotten corner, but a hive of quiet industry. The single sliver of light from the high window was her clock, its slow journey across the packed earth floor marking the hours of her day. Her fingers, once raw from farm work, grew nimble and sure, dancing with the needle and thread. She came to know the stories of the town through the items brought to her. She mended the threadbare wool coat of a ranch hand who had ridden through a thorn patch, the fine linen church dress of a woman who valued appearances, and the sturdy canvas trousers of a dozen farmers and laborers. She learned who was thrifty, who was careless, and who cherished their few possessions with a fierce, quiet pride. She was no longer just the tall woman who had been left at the station. She was becoming the seamstress, a small but essential gear in the town's machinery. But her day truly began and ended with Silas. She would hear him long before she saw him. In the late afternoon, as the shadows of the junipers stretched like long fingers toward the cabin, she would hear the sound of his horse's hooves on the trail. It was a sound she came to know intimately, not a hurried clatter, but a slow, weary, and certain tread. She would not stop her work. She would not run to the door. She would simply continue her stitching. The knowledge of his return a quiet comfort in the back of her mind. He would tend to his horse first, always. Then he would come inside, bringing with him the scent of the wilderness of pine needles, of dust, of the cool evening air. He would hang his hat on a peg by the door and wash his face and hands in a basin of water. He moved with a deliberate silence, his presence filling the small cabin not with noise, but with a sense of solid, grounded reality. Their evenings were rituals of quiet companionship. They did not talk much. There was no need for the polite, empty chatter that filled parlors back east. Their conversation was in their actions. She would have a simple meal ready, a stew simmering over the fire, made with the vegetables and flour she had earned, supplemented by a rabbit or squirrel he had brought back from his trap lines. He would eat with a slow, appreciative hunger, and she would find a deep and surprising satisfaction in the simple act of feeding him. After eating, they would sit by the fire, the silence between them as comfortable and familiar as a well-worn blanket. She would often have some mending to do, her needle flashing in the firelight. He would engage in his own quiet tasks. Sometimes he would be cleaning a rifle, the scent of gun oil sharp in the air. Other times he would be sharpening his knives, the soft asterisk of the whetstone, a rhythmic counterpoint to the crackle of the flames. It was during these evenings that he left his small, unspoken gifts. They were never given directly to her. They would simply appear. One night, she found 2 perfectly formed potatoes resting on the corner of her work crate in the lean-to. Another time, a bundle of dry, resinous kindling, perfect for starting her morning fire, was stacked neatly by her door. These were not offerings of courtship. They were the practical, thoughtful gestures of a man who spoke the language of survival and quiet care. His most personal offerings were the carvings. He was a whittler, his scarred, powerful hands surprisingly deft with a small, sharp knife. He would take a piece of cottonwood or pine and, over the course of several evenings, coax a shape from it. He never seemed to be working with any urgency. The process was slow, meditative. When he was done for the night, he would leave the unfinished piece on the mantelpiece, as if he had simply forgotten it there. The first carving was a hawk, its wings half spread, its head turned as if listening to the wind. Lydia would study it each morning after he had left, tracing the progress from the night before, marveling at how he could find such life in a simple piece of wood. After the hawk came a fox, its body coiled in a tight, clever sleep. Each piece was a small window into his silent world, a glimpse of the wild, watchful things that occupied his thoughts when he was alone in the woods. She never mentioned them, and he never pointed them out. They were just there, a shared secret in the quiet of the cabin. In this way, a life was built, a strange, unspoken partnership that existed in the spaces between words. Lydia found a measure of peace she had never expected. She had a purpose, a home, and the quiet respect of a man who asked nothing of her but that she be herself. And yet, a thread of unease ran beneath the calm surface of her days. She was living in another woman's house. She slept on a pallet while Sarah Boone's rocking chair sat empty by the fire. She ate at a table Silas had likely built for a life with someone else. She was an imposter, a temporary fixture in a life still defined by a profound loss. The town might be starting to accept her, but what was she accepting for herself? Was this her future, to live in the shadow of a ghost, on the charity of a man to whom she owed everything? The question grew louder as the nights grew longer. One evening, the wind howled around the cabin, a lonely, mournful sound that seemed to slip through the cracks in the logs. The fire roared in the hearth, a bastion of warmth and light against the vast, dark emptiness outside. Lydia was trying to thread a needle, but the flickering light made her fumble. Silas sat across from her, working on a new carving, a small, cautious-looking deer. The silence in the room felt different tonight, heavier. The sound of the wind was like a question, demanding an answer she did not have. She set her needle and thread aside, her hands suddenly unsteady. "Silas," she said, and the sound of his name on her lips felt strange, too intimate. He paused his work, his knife hovering over the wood, but he did not look up. She took a breath, the words tumbling out in a quiet rush. "I don't know if staying is the right thing. For me to be here, in your home." She left the rest unsaid. Asterisk, in her home. He didn't answer right away. The only sounds were the fire and the wind and the frantic beating of her own heart. She had broken their unspoken rules, had brought the uncertainty of the outside world into their quiet sanctuary. She expected him to tell her she was right, that it was time for her to go. She expected him to finally look at her with the pity she had dreaded from the beginning. Instead, he slowly, deliberately, closed his pocket knife and set it and the half-finished deer on the floor beside him. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, and stared into the fire, its light playing across his weathered face and highlighting the faint, silvery line of the scar beneath his eye. "When Sarah died," he began, his voice a low rumble. The world went silent, and then it got loud. Folks came by, the preacher, the women from town. They all looked at me, looked at the empty chair. They brought food and they brought words, but all I could hear was what their eyes were saying. "Poor Silas." They were saying, "Poor, lonely man." He shook his head slightly. "Their eyes put a label on me, put me in a box. I was the widower, the man to be pitied. It was like they buried me right alongside her." He fell silent, watching the flames dance and weave. Lydia held her breath, understanding that he was giving her something far more precious than a simple answer. He was giving her a piece of his own story. "You came here," he continued, his gaze still fixed on the fire, "and you didn't have those eyes. And in your workshop, the town started listening to the sound of your needle, instead of looking at the story they'd made up about you." He finally turned his head, not to look at her, but to look at the empty rocking chair. "Don't look, Lydia," he said, his voice soft but filled with a conviction that resonated deep in her soul. "Don't look at this chair, or at this cabin, or at what folks in town might be whispering. Don't look at what you think is supposed to be." He paused, and his next words were the core of his entire being, the philosophy he had offered her on the church steps, now given to her as the greatest gift he possessed. "Listen," he said. "Listen to the sound of your own two hands working, to the fire keeping the cold out. Listen to your own breathing in a place where you're safe." He finally risked a glance in her direction, his blue eyes clear and steady in the firelight. The heart knows long before the eyes do. Trust what you hear, not what you see. His words from that night became a new kind of anchor for Lydia. Asterisk. Trust what you hear, not what you see. She held on to them as the last golden days of autumn gave way to a starker, colder landscape. The wind from the north began to carry a bite, and the sky, once a brilliant, piercing blue, often settled into a flat, impenetrable sheet of gray. The people of Dust Rock began bringing her heavier things to mend wool coats, thick blankets, the felt linings of boots. They spoke of winter with a grim, knowing respect. And she, in turn, worked to prepare the small cabin for the coming cold, stitching draft stoppers for the bottoms of the doors and reinforcing the seals on the windows with strips of spare cloth. The storm did not arrive with a dramatic announcement. It began as a betrayal of the light. One afternoon, the sun, which had been a pale but present disk in the sky, simply vanished. A strange, pearlescent twilight descended, hushing the world. The wind, which had been a gusty, blustering thing, fell away into a dead, expectant calm. From her workshop, Lydia looked out the small window and saw the first flakes of snow begin to drift down. They were large and lazy, like white feathers, beautiful and benign. She felt a moment of quiet pleasure, a memory of snowfalls back in Ohio. But this was different. There was a weight to the silence, an ominous quality to the unnaturally bright air. She saw Silas coming up the trail, his horse moving at a quicker pace than usual. He wasn't looking at the sky, but he was feeling it. A sixth sense, honed by years of living under its vast and unforgiving expanse. By the time he had stabled the horse and was making his way to the cabin, the lazy flakes had been replaced by a fine, hard-driven sleet that hissed as it hit the frozen ground. The wind was back, no longer gusting but a solid, whining force that seemed to press against the very walls of the world. "It's here," was all he said as he came through the door, bringing a blast of frigid air with him. He didn't mean the snow. He meant the winter, the real winter. Together, in a quiet, efficient dance that needed no words, they made the final preparations. He brought in armload after armload of firewood, stacking it high against the wall near the hearth until the scent of pine filled the small room. She shuttered the windows, plunging the cabin into a dim, fire-lit twilight. The sound of the wind and sleet immediately muffled to a distant roar. When he finally barred the heavy plank door, the click of the wooden bolt falling into place felt utterly final. The world outside, the town of Dust Rock, the entire unforgiving prairie, was gone. Their universe had shrunk to the 4 log walls of the cabin. They were trapped. But as Lydia looked at the roaring fire, at the towering stack of wood, at the quiet, capable man checking the seals on the shutters, she did not feel fear. She felt, for the first time in a long, long while, completely and utterly safe. The storm raged. The wind shrieked and clawed at the roof, and the snow, now thick and heavy, piled in deep drifts against the walls. Hours passed. The dim light from the cracks in the shutters faded to nothing. The only light was from the fire, which cast their shadows, huge and dancing, against the log walls. The cabin, which had always felt small, now seemed like a fortress, a warm, beating heart in the midst of a frozen, dead world. The silence between them was different now. It was not the silence of strangers finding their way, nor the comfortable silence of evening companionship. It was the deep, resonant silence of 2 people alone against the elements, a shared solitude that was more intimate than any conversation. Eventually, hunger made itself known, a simple animal need. Silas rose and went to the small root-cellar trapdoor in the floor. He came back with a handful of onions, a few wrinkled potatoes, and a small sack of carrots, their green tops long gone. He placed them on the table without a word. It was a question, and Lydia knew the answer. She took the vegetables to a basin to wash them, the icy well water biting at her fingers. She laid them out on a clean cloth and picked up her cutting knife. While she worked, Silas filled a heavy iron pot with water and hung it on the swing arm over the fire. She began with the onions, her knife moving with a swift, practiced rhythm. Then the potatoes, peeling them with a frugality that left almost no flesh on the skins, cutting them into neat, even cubes. The sounds filled the cabin, the crisp slice of the knife, the soft thud as the pieces fell onto the wooden board, the hiss and crackle of the fire, and the ceaseless, elemental howl of the wind outside. It was a small symphony of domesticity against a backdrop of wild chaos. Finally, she took up the carrots. She laid one on the board, and her knife began its work. Asterisk, thump, thump, thump. Each slice was exactly the same thickness. Each motion was precise, economical. without a single wasted movement. She was not just cutting carrots. She was imposing order on a small corner of the world. It was the same way she stitched a seam, the same way she folded a blanket, the same way she had rebuilt her life from the scraps of another's rejection. It was who she was. She was so focused on her task that she didn't notice Silas watching her. He was not staring. He sat on a low stool by the fire, pretending to clean his pipe, but his gaze was on her hands, on the steady, certain rhythm of her work. He was not looking. He was listening. She scraped the vegetables into the pot of boiling water, adding a pinch of salt and some dried herbs from a small pouch that hung by the mantel. She stirred the mixture with a long wooden spoon, and soon the rich, earthy smell of soup began to fill the cabin, a scent of warmth and sustenance that pushed back against the cold. They ate at the table, their bowls cradled in their hands for warmth. The firelight flickered across their faces, creating and erasing expressions in the blink of an eye. They did not speak. There was nothing to say that the storm and the soup were not already saying for them. They were here. They were warm. They were fed. In this place. At this moment. That was everything. After they had eaten and the bowls had been cleaned and put away, they returned to their places by the fire. The storm seemed to have intensified, the wind a physical presence that made the sturdy logs of the cabin groan. Lydia stared into the flames, her thoughts a swirling eddy like the snow outside. She thought of the long road that had brought her here, of the man with hair like wheat, of the public shame and the private despair. It all seemed a lifetime ago, a story that had happened to someone else. She looked over at Silas. He was staring into the fire as well, his face unreadable, his thoughts his own. He was a man who had offered her shelter without question, who had given her a home without expectation. He had shared his food, his fire, his solitude, but he had never shared his curiosity. He had never asked her for the story that the entire town already knew. The question rose in her throat and came out on a whisper, so quiet it was almost lost in the roar of the wind. "You don't ask me about my past." It wasn't an accusation. It was a marvel, a thing she still couldn't quite comprehend. Silas did not move. He did not turn his head or shift his gaze from the hypnotic dance of the flames. The firelight highlighted the sharp line of his jaw, the quiet strength in the set of his mouth. For a long moment, she thought he hadn't heard her. "I don't need to know," he said, his voice a low rumble, as deep and steady as the heart of the fire itself. He still didn't look up. He reached for his pipe, his movements slow and deliberate. The answer was so final, so absolute. It should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. It was what he said next that unraveled the last knot of fear in her heart. He paused, his thumb rubbing the bowl of his unlit pipe. "I hear enough," he said, his voice still quiet, still fixed on the fire. "I hear enough from the way you cut a carrot." The word struck her with a force that was physical. She felt a jolt, as if a circuit had suddenly been connected. The way she cut a carrot, the rhythmic, steady, precise sound, the economy of motion, the refusal to waste. He had heard it all. He had heard her practicality. He had heard her resilience. He had heard the story of a woman who knew how to make something from nothing, how to impose order on chaos, how to survive. He didn't need the sordid details of her arrival in Dust Rock because, in the simple act of her preparing their meal, he had heard the entire history of her character. He had listened to the truth of her, and had found it to be enough. The storm howled on, but inside the small log cabin, a profound and unshakable quiet had fallen. Lydia looked at the man across the fire from her, and for the first time, she wasn't just looking at her savior or her landlord. She was looking at a man who understood her in a way no one, not even she herself, had ever understood before. The blizzard that had sealed them in the cabin eventually broke, leaving behind a world transformed. Dust Rock was no longer a town of brown dirt and gray wood, but a place of breathtaking, brilliant white. The snow lay in deep, sculptural drifts, muffling all sound and forcing a quiet peace upon the land. Winter had arrived in earnest. and with it came a change in the town's spirit. The harshness of the season forged a deeper need for community, a huddling together against the long, dark nights. It was this spirit that gave birth to the winter festival. It was not a grand affair, just a simple gathering announced by a notice nailed to the door of the general store. There would be music, food, and a fire in the big pot-bellied stove at the town hall. It was a promise of light and warmth in the heart of the cold. The invitation to Lydia came not from the notice, but from the gentle, persistent encouragement of old Mrs. Gable. "It's a time to be neighborly." "Child," the old woman had said, her eyes sharp and knowing, "you are a part of this town now. Your hands have mended half the coats in it. It's time you showed your face." The thought sent a familiar chill of fear through Lydia. To go to a town gathering meant facing everyone at once. It meant seeing the faces that had watched her with pity and scorn. It meant, almost certainly, seeing Jonathan Clark. But as she stood in her small workshop, she looked down at her own hands, at the needle she held poised over a piece of deep blue wool. Silas's words echoed in her mind. Asterisk, listen to the sound of your own two hands working. Her hands had earned her a place here. Perhaps Mrs. Gable was right. Perhaps it was time to claim it. So, she began to make a dress. It was her declaration, her armor, and her art, all in one. She had no fine silks or velvets, only a bolt of dark blue wool she had taken as payment for mending the mercantile owner's entire stock of winter blankets. The color was the deep, rich blue of a winter sky just after sunset, in her small, quiet workshop, with the snow piled high outside her window. She cut and stitched. The design was her own, born of practicality and an innate sense of grace. It was simple, with long, close-fitting sleeves, a high collar, and a skirt that fell in a clean, straight line to the floor. There was no lace, no ruffles, no ornamentation of any kind. Its only decoration was the perfection of its construction. Every seam was true, every stitch a testament to her skill. When she tried it on, the dress did not hide her height. It celebrated it, giving her a stark, simple elegance, like a tall pine tree against the snow. She did not ask Silas if he would go with her. She did not need to. The night of the festival, when he came in from his chores, he did not settle by the fire in his usual work clothes. He washed with particular care and then emerged from the corner of the cabin where he slept, wearing a shirt she had not seen before. It was made of a soft, faded cotton, but it was clean and carefully mended, a task she had performed weeks ago. He wore it tucked into his best pair of trousers. He did not look festive, but he looked ready. He was a man preparing to stand guard. The walk into town was quiet and cold. The snow crunched under their boots, and their breath plumed in the frigid air. The windows of the town hall glowed with a warm, yellow light, a beacon in the blue twilight. As they approached, they could hear the cheerful, scraping sound of a fiddle and the low hum of dozens of voices. Standing on the steps, Lydia's courage almost failed her. It was one thing to make the dress, another to wear it into the heart of the town that had so thoroughly rejected her. She felt Silas's presence beside her, solid and silent. He did not touch her, did not speak a word of encouragement, but she drew strength from him all the same. She took a breath, lifted her chin, and pushed open the door. The wave of warmth and noise that hit them was almost a physical blow. The room was crowded, filled with the entire population of Dust Rock. A massive fire roared in the stove. Pine boughs decorated the rafters, and the air was thick with the scent of hot cider and roasting meat. For a moment, all Lydia could do was stand in the doorway, her eyes adjusting to the light, her heart pounding in her chest. A hush fell over the conversations nearest the door. Heads turned. People looked, but the stares were different this time. The raw, scornful curiosity of that first day was gone. In its place was a kind of grudging respect, an acknowledgement. They were looking at Lydia May Foster, the seamstress, the woman whose quiet, capable hands had saved them the cost of a new coat or a new blanket. She saw Martha Miller, who gave her a small, shy smile. She saw Mrs. Gable, who offered a stately, approving nod from her chair of honor near the fire. And then she saw him. Jonathan Clark was standing with a group of the town's more prosperous men. On his arm was a young woman, small and pretty and delicate, with blonde hair done up in elaborate curls. He looked prosperous, pleased with himself. His eyes met Lydia's across the crowded room. She saw a flicker of surprise in his expression, a flicker of something else, unease, perhaps. He had expected her to be gone, a faded, embarrassing memory. He had not expected to see her here, standing tall and straight in a dress of midnight blue, looking not like a victim, but like a queen in exile. Lydia held his gaze. She did not smile, nor did she scowl. She simply looked at him, and in her steady, clear-eyed gaze, there was no pain, no anger, no hint of the broken woman he had left on the train platform. There was only a vast, calm distance. She was the one who broke the gaze, turning away from him not in defeat, but in dismissal. He was a part of her past, a closed chapter. She and Silas found a place along the back wall, away from the main throng. As always, Silas seemed to fade into the shadows, a quiet observer content at the edge of things. He stood with his shoulders resting against the rough-hewn planks, his arms crossed over his chest, his gaze sweeping the room but never settling for long. Lydia stood beside him, her hands clasped in front of her. She was in the room, but she was also in a sanctuary of silence that they had brought with them. The fiddler played lively reels and stomping barn dances. Couples grabbed each other and spun across the floor, their laughter loud and hearty. Lydia watched them, a strange sense of detachment settling over her. She was here, she was accepted, but she was not one of them. She did not know how to laugh so easily, how to move with such unthinking joy. Then the music changed. The fiddler drew a long, slow note from his instrument, joined by a man with a worn guitar. The melody that filled the room was a waltz, a simple, melancholic tune that spoke of long winters and distant memories. The boisterous energy of the room softened. Couples paired off, moving together in a slow, graceful circle. The lanterns cast a soft, flickering light, and the room was filled with the gentle, rhythmic shuffle of boots on the wooden floor. The sight was beautiful, but it was also profoundly painful. It was a vision of a life she had once dreamed of, a life of simple, shared joys, of belonging, of a hand to hold in the dance. The sight of the swirling couples, the soft lights, the sweet, sad music, it was all too much. It was a feast for the eyes, and her eyes had only ever brought her sorrow. She turned her head slightly toward Silas, who stood unmoving beside her, a solid shadow in the flickering light. She could feel the warmth of his body, though they were not touching. "Don't look," she whispered, her voice barely a tremor. It was a plea. She could not bear to watch this vision of happiness that felt so far from her own. He did not turn his head. He did not ask why. He simply understood. His voice, when it came, was a low rumble, meant only for her. "Then listen," he said. It was his creed, his gift to her. He was reminding her to trust the world beyond sight, to trust the truth she could feel. Lydia closed her eyes, shutting out the dancing couples, the warm light, the ghost of Jonathan Clark, the entire judging, watching world. And she listened. She heard the sweet, sad song of the fiddle. She heard the gentle strum of the guitar. She heard the rhythmic whisper of boots on the floorboards. She heard the crackle of the fire in the stove and the faint, low murmur of the wind outside. And then, in an act of trust so complete, it stole her breath. She took a small step back and leaned against him. She felt the solid, unyielding strength of his back. Through the wool of her dress and the cotton of his shirt, she could feel the living warmth of him, the slow, steady beat of his heart. He did not flinch or stiffen. He simply stood there, a bulwark against the world, and let her lean, with her eyes closed, sheltered by his stillness. Lydia danced, not with her feet, but with her heart. She was not on the outside looking in. She was in the center of the music, in the center of the warmth, anchored by the quiet, steady man who had taught her how to truly hear. And for the first time, she felt like she was home. The fragile peace Lydia had built for herself was shattered by the arrival of a man in a wagon full of cheap tinware and brightly colored ribbons. His name was Elias Vance, and he brought with him a smooth, charming smile and a voice as sweet and cloying as molasses. He was a traveling peddler, a man who traded in gossip as much as in goods, and he was a ghost from a past Lydia thought she had left 1,000 miles behind her in the muddy lanes of Ohio. He set up his wares on barrels outside the general store, and the town, starved for novelty, flocked to him. Lydia first saw him from a distance, recognizing the confident, preening way he held himself long before she could make out his face. A cold knot of dread formed in her stomach. Elias Vance was a man whose polite advances she had once firmly and publicly rebuffed. He was not a man who forgave a slight to his pride. Their meeting was inevitable. He sought her out as she was leaving the mercantile, his face a mask of delighted surprise. "Lydia May Foster, as I live and breathe. I heard you'd come out west, but to find you in a place like this, it's a wonder." His eyes, small and clever, took in her simple dress, the strength in her hands, the cabin on the edge of town where everyone knew she lived. His smile was all teeth. "You've certainly landed on your feet." Lydia's response was cool and polite, giving away nothing, but the encounter left her shaken. She knew Elias. She knew the poison that lay coiled behind his smile. The poison began to seep into the town's bloodstream almost immediately. It was subtle at first. A woman who had been friendly the day before now gave her a curt, dismissive nod. An order for mending a set of curtains was quietly canceled. The whispers started again, but this time they were different. They were not born of curiosity, but of a dark, knowing certainty. Elias did not spread lies. He cultivated them. He would speak to a group of men in the saloon, his voice low with feigned sympathy. A terrible shame. What happened to Lydia's family? He'd sigh, shaking his head. She had so much promise, but she always had a weakness for easy comforts, made some choices that broke her father's heart. To the women gathered around his wagon, he would speak of her restless spirit and how she'd left a trail of disappointments back home. He never made a direct accusation. He was a master of the poisonous implication, planting seeds of doubt that he knew would flourish in the fertile soil of the town's suspicion. The rumor, when it finally took its ugliest shape, was a simple, brutal one. "She's not a good person." It was a vague and damning verdict, a stain that spread to cover everything she had painstakingly built. Her skill was now cunning. Her quiet dignity was now proof of a secret, shameful past. Her arrangement with Silas, which had been a subject of grudging acceptance, was now cast in a sinister, unseemly light. She was not a survivor. She was an opportunist, a woman of loose morals who had tricked a lonely, grieving man. The work dried up. The friendly nods vanished. The door to her workshop remained closed. The isolation she felt was a bitter echo of her first days in Dust Rock. But it was sharper now, for she had known the warmth of acceptance before it was snatched away. She retreated into the silence of the cabin, the hurt a constant, dull ache in her chest. Silas knew. He did not ask, but she saw it in the hard set of his jaw when he returned from town, in the way his eyes would rest for a moment too long on her bent head as she stared into the fire. He saw the life draining out of the small world they had built, and his silence grew heavier, charged with a gathering storm. The crisis came to a head on a Sunday. There was to be a town meeting at the old abandoned church. The pretext was to discuss the allocation of funds for a new schoolhouse, but everyone knew the real reason. Elias Vance had fanned the flames of discontent until they had become a public inferno. The town had to decide what to do about the woman in their midst, the stain on their community. Lydia had no intention of going. She would not subject herself to a public trial. But as the time for the meeting approached, Silas came into the cabin from the woodpile. He was wearing the clean shirt he'd worn to the winter festival. "It's time," he said. It was not a question. "I'm not going," she said, her voice tight. "I won't let them look at me like that again." "I'm not asking you to let them look," he said, his voice quiet but unyielding. "I'm asking you to stand." He walked out the door, leaving her with a choice. She could stay here, a prisoner in the only place she'd ever felt safe, and let the lies have their final victory. Or she could follow the one man who had never looked at her with judgment and face the fire. She took a deep, shuddering breath, smoothed the front of her simple wool dress, and followed him. The entire town was gathered at the church. They filled the dusty pews and stood in the aisles, their faces grim and expectant in the cold winter light slanting through the grimy windows. Elias Vance stood near the front, looking pious and concerned, the very picture of a man burdened by a sad but necessary truth. When Silas and Lydia entered, a wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. They stopped at the back, just inside the doorway. Silas's presence was a palpable thing. He was not a big man, but he seemed to take up all the space in the room, his quiet solidity a rebuke to the frantic, gossiping energy of the crowd. The meeting began, and after a few perfunctory words about the schoolhouse, the town elder cleared his throat and turned the proceedings to the real issue at hand. He spoke of the town's reputation, of the need for moral character, of the unsettling rumors that had come to their attention. Elias Vance stepped forward, his moment finally at hand. "Friends," he began, his voice dripping with false sorrow. "It pains me to speak of this. I have known Miss Foster a long time. I had hoped she might find a way to leave her past behind her here. I prayed she had changed her ways." Before he could continue, Silas moved. He walked from the back of the church, his steps slow and deliberate, the soft jingle of his spurs the only sound in the suddenly silent room. He did not walk to the front to confront Vance. He walked to the very center of the church, turning to face the whole congregation. He stood in the main aisle, a solitary, unmovable figure. "I've heard the whispers," he said, his voice not loud, but carrying to every corner of the room. "I've heard what this man has been selling you, and I've watched you all buy it." His gaze swept over them, missing no one. "When Miss Foster first came here, you all looked at her. You saw a woman who was too tall, a woman who was alone, a woman who didn't fit the picture in your heads. And you judged her. You put her on those steps," he said, gesturing with his head toward the entrance. "And you left her there." He paused, letting the weight of their collective memory settle on them. "Then she started to work, and you stopped looking and you started listening. You heard the sound of her needle. You heard how she could take what was torn and make it whole. You heard that she was honest and fair, and for a little while, you judged her by her hands, not by your eyes." He turned his head slightly, his gaze falling on Elias Vance, who looked suddenly smaller. His charm curdled into a sullen anger. Now this man comes along, with a sweet voice and a wagon full of cheap goods, and he tells you a story, and you've all gone back to looking at the story, instead of listening to the truth you already know. He turned back to the crowd, to the faces of the people who had been her customers, her neighbors. "You want to know what to do about the woman living in my house?" he asked, his voice dropping to a low, powerful intensity. "Then I'll tell you. She is a woman who has known cruelty and has not become cruel. She is a woman who was abandoned and has not abandoned herself. She is a woman who works harder than any two men in this town." He took a breath, and his final words were not for them, but a declaration, a creed, a testament. "I don't need her to be perfect," Silas Boone said to the silent, watching town. "I just need someone real." A profound silence filled the church. The truth of his words, so simple and so powerful, seemed to suck the very air from the room, leaving the lies of Elias Vance exposed and tawdry. And as he stood there, a lone man defending a simple truth, Lydia moved. She walked from the shadows of the doorway, down the aisle, until she was standing just behind him. She could feel the strength radiating from him like heat from a fire. She felt the eyes of the entire town fall upon her. But for the first time in her life, she did not flinch. For the first time, she did not lower her gaze or stoop her shoulders. She stood tall, her spine straight, and looked out at the faces of the people of Dustrock. She stood behind Silas, not to hide, but to have his back, and she did not, for a single moment, bow her head. They left the church in silence, walking back through the cold, clean air under a sky full of sharp, winter stars. The town was hushed behind them, the voices that had risen against her now quieted, shamed by a simple truth. Elias Vance had slipped away during Silas's speech, a snake retreating to the shadows, and they both knew his wagon would be gone by morning. Nothing more was said. They reached the cabin, and the familiar rituals of the evening took over, stoking the fire, sharing a meal of bread and cold meat. The silence between them no longer a space to be carefully navigated, but a shared territory, a country they now inhabited together. The next morning, Lydia rose before dawn. The world outside was a deep, soft blue, the snow glowing with a faint, reflected light. The cabin was still and quiet, Silas a still form under his blankets. She moved with practiced stealth, adding a log to the embers in the hearth until a small, steady flame caught. Instead of starting her usual work, she took a piece of soft, gray flannel she had been saving, a length of fabric she'd received in trade for turning the collar and cuffs on a rancher's finest shirt. It was good material, warm and sturdy, but soft to the touch. She took it to her workshop, in the pale, pre-dawn light that filtered through her small window. She laid the fabric out on her work table. She did not need a pattern. Her eyes and hands knew the measure of the man. She thought of the breadth of his shoulders, the length of his arms, the way he moved, without wasted motion, as he chopped wood or tended his horse. This was different from all the sewing she had done before. Mending was an act of preservation, of holding back the inevitable decay of things. It was a fight against time, but this was an act of creation. She was not fixing something broken. She was making something new. Each snip of her shears through the fabric was a decisive, deliberate cut. Each pin she placed was an anchor for a new reality. As she began to sew, her needle moving with a swift, steady rhythm, she realized she was not just stitching cloth. She was stitching together the torn pieces of her own life. The Lydia who had stepped off that train, full of fragile, letter-fed hope, was a stranger to her now. The woman who had sat broken on the church steps was a ghost. This woman, the one whose needle flew with a quiet, confident purpose, was someone new. She had been forged in the crucible of this town's judgment and tempered by one man's quiet, unwavering faith. The sun was up now, casting a pale gold light across the snow and through her window, illuminating the fine dust motes dancing in the air. The main seam of the shirt was done, the body of it taking shape under her hands. It was a good, honest garment, strong, simple, and true, like the man it was for. She heard the soft creak of the cabin door, the sound of his boots on the wooden floor. She did not look up, did not pause in her work. Her focus was absolute. Push, pull, loop. The thread became a line. The line became a seam. The seam became a shelter. He appeared in the doorway of her workshop. He did not speak for a long time. Simply stood there, his presence filling the small space. She could feel his gaze, not on her, but on her hands, on the work they were doing. He was not looking. He was listening to the story her needle was telling. Finally, he spoke, and his voice was low, rough with the morning. "I didn't invite you to stay." The words hung in the quiet air. They were not an accusation, not a reminder of a debt. They were a simple, unvarnished statement of fact, a clearing of the ground between them. He was acknowledging the beginning of their story, the strange, unasked-for circumstance that had brought them together. He was making sure there were no illusions, no polite fictions to hide behind. Lydia paused her stitching, her needle held poised in mid-air. She looked down at the gray flannel, at the neat, even stitches that were binding it together. "I know," she said, her own voice soft, but clear and steady. She knew. She had never forgotten that she was a piece of driftwood that had washed up on his shore. She knew that his kindness had been a response to his own past, not a request for her future. He was quiet for another long moment. She could hear the soft hiss of the fire from the main room, the faint whisper of the wind around the eaves. She felt him take a step into the room, his shadow falling across her work table. "But you're still here," he said. It was not a question, but it held the weight of one. It was the crux of everything. Her staying had ceased to be a matter of circumstance and had become a matter of will. Her will. The silence that followed was her answer, but he was waiting for her to claim it. Slowly, she lifted her head and looked at him. His face was calm in the morning light, his blue eyes clear. The scar beneath his eye was just a part of him, like the lines of weather and time. In his gaze, she saw no questions, no demands, only a deep and profound stillness. She gave a single slow nod. That was all, a nod. A universe of meaning passed between them in that simple, silent gesture. It was an affirmation, a choice, a declaration that this place, this small cabin on the edge of a harsh and unforgiving world, was now her home because she had chosen to make it so. A faint, almost imperceptible softening happened around his eyes. He understood. He had not offered her a future, but he had given her the space to build one for herself, and she had taken it. He did not move closer. He did not reach for her. In a world of men who took what they wanted, his restraint was the most powerful, most intimate gesture he could make. A kiss would have been a lie, a betrayal of the quiet, deep language they had built together. A touch would have been a trespass on a trust that had been earned in silence and truth, not in passion. Their connection was something forged in a different kind of fire. He took a step back, moving out of the light of the window, his voice dropping to a near whisper, a secret meant only for the two of them in the quiet of the morning. "If you close your eyes," Silas Boone said, "I'll still be here." It was the greatest promise a man had ever made her. It was the antithesis of Jonathan Clark, a man who had vanished the moment he truly saw her. It was the fulfillment of the creed Silas lived by. He was offering her a certainty that existed beyond the fickle, judging world of sight. He was telling her that his presence was a truth she could feel, a constant she could trust in the darkness. Lydia looked at him for a moment longer, memorizing the quiet strength in his face. Then she let her eyelids drift shut. The world of sight fell away. The workshop, the half-finished shirt, the morning light, all of it was gone. But he was not. She could feel his presence in the room, as solid and real as the floor beneath her feet, as warm and steady as the fire in the hearth. She could hear the sound of his quiet breathing. He was here. He was real. And in the warm, safe darkness, Lydia Mae Foster smiled. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. Your support means the world, and hitting the hype button helps more people discover these stories.